What are some concerns you have about our school systems?
Well, from the mayor's office, and that's the perspective that I'm representing, safety of students is the concern. And as you guys probably know, my wife is a principal at West and has been involved in the school system for 20 however many years. So safety of students at lunch hour and safety of students after school and what they do and how they terrorize neighborhoods or do not is a major concern and puts certain demands on our police department. So I'm concerned with safety, and that's what just any normal teenager would do. I'm also concerned with gangs and whether or not they're infiltrating Norman and how we treat that and how sensitive we are to that issue, and we try to be really careful with it. And how acute that problem is kind of comes and goes. But mostly the city's concerns about schools are traffic concerns and safety of kids.
7 years is a pretty standard life cycle for a city manager, isn't it?
Well, actually, the average life cycle of a city manager is about 2.5 years in one place,
Okay.
and then they move along. You have different, you have changing councils with different political ideas and policy viewpoints, and normally with changing councils, you'll see city managers that may be moving up to other positions.
Okay.
What goals, as we go into 1997, do you have set as your position as city manager?
I think there are 2 or 3 sort of major community goals. Obviously, we have the sub-goals of our construction projects and completing those and so forth. But in terms of community goals, I think it will be adoption of our land use plan that's envisioning into the future of what Norman is going to be like and how we're going to use our land. Working to completion with a group of people that are involved in Link Norman, who are also involved with looking at the future of our community in terms of education and crime and families and things of that nature, and developing initiatives to improve our future. Third item is an economic development coalition between the university, the chamber, and the city. We have just established that, and the board is now beginning to work. And in this coming year, we want to solidify that and hire staff and begin to implement an economic development plan.
What prospects do you see for education in the next session of legislature?
I think continuing funding from the general fund, the appropriation process, and like I said, higher ed. Higher ed is kind of set on the back burner for quite some time because of secondary education, the funding of the $200 million that we put into secondary ed in elementary and junior high and high schools. But it's going to be a continued concern, and I think the continued funding. And of course, I hope that what we can do next year is go back to Senate Bill 1100, where that we make sure that career teachers are given continue getting raises and more money for all the many years of service and all the things that the career teachers have done to improve education and help education in past years.
Yes, why have you decided to run for Congress?
The real reason I'm running for Congress is because I think that the stakes in the 1996 election are very, very high. Since 1994, we've seen a Congress that got elected in 1994 go to great lengths to implement an agenda that I think doesn't honor the priorities and needs of the people in the 4th Congressional District of Oklahoma. I think that those decisions have been supported by our current congressman, and I feel that that we need to have an election, 1996, to decide if we're going to continue on that road or make a change. I think the people have been in our national and local and congressional elections have been voting for change in 1992, again in 1994, and I believe that they'll be continuing to look for change in 1996. And I also want to run on some principles and some elements of my campaign strongly related to national defense, commitment to public education, to balancing the federal budget, and to trying to bridge the gap between environmental protection and free enterprise. There's this belief that you can't you've got to have one and not the other. That somehow if you're committed to free enterprise, you can't be for protecting the environment, and if you're for protecting the environment, you can't be for free enterprise. And those are that's an unfortunate polarization that's occurred on that issue. And I think what we need is a congressman like myself who will get in there and try to put together some environmental policies that are based upon pollution prevention. Instead of fixing up an environmental problem after it happens, let's stop them from happening in the first place. And those.
Senator Hobson, how do you accomplish anything in the legislature when you have a governor who chooses not to cooperate?
And I did not give Julian that question. We can either focus on our disagreements or focus on our agreements, and the governor would argue that we agree about a lot. And that's true. He vetoed only about $16 million of various items last year, and a lot of people liked that. The problem I had with the vetoes were, the problems I had were that they didn't make much sense. 60% of the vetoed money went to education. Why in the world, when you're working as hard as you can to bring education up, would you veto Head Start money for children who don't have that opportunity? The rest of the money that he vetoed, most of it fell in the area of law enforcement. The Attorney General, who's the chief law enforcement officer for the state, $1 million vetoed from his budget to accelerate death penalty cases. So I think they were just a statement by the governor saying, remember me, I'm here, I'm on the second floor, and I'll veto what I want because I know the House Republicans, to a man and a woman, will sustain my veto, which they have the numbers to do that. But they were not, in my opinion, very logical vetoes on his part, and I think they've come to regret them.
What are the primary issues in this campaign for you?
Oh, they vary. I think the primary issues for me are the fact that as a one-term senator, I have been very effective. I've done a lot of things, you know, from reduced taxes to strengthen criminal laws, to giving parents more authority over their children, on and on and on. And you know, my issues are my track record and the fact that I'm fair, I work hard, and I listen to everybody. And I think those are the primary issues for me.
Our student guests this week are Julian Lever and Amy Kuhnhart, and they're going to talk to you about the transition, the second one that you've been through. So
Right.
You're an expert on the subject. I think, Julian, you get to go first.
All right, my first question is, at the new high school, will there be transfers allowed? And if so, what will be the conditions for the transfers?
Well, that's a really good question because the transfer policy has not been established. Last year, we had a Citizens Advisory Council, and those are parents and patrons from around the community who serve on a council to study issues. And they studied the boundary issues last year, and they made a recommendation to our Board of Education. And the Board of Education is the body elected by citizens in town who make policy. And the transfer issue would be a policy. So this year, the board asked the Citizens Advisory Council to study the transfer policy and to give them some options for short-term policy, in other words, maybe some things that we would do in the school district just for 1 year, and to study long-term options for the policy. And the Citizens Advisory Council has been doing that this year. They've had a set of public hearings. They're working on their recommendations. They will go back in November for another set of public hearings to listen to parents and students and citizens, and then they will make some recommendations to the Board of Education. And I believe the timeline on that transfer policy is, it's January or February, I think. And so after the first of the year, then students will know what the transfer options will be.
Right.
Okay. Will we continue to have off-campus lunches?
There are no plans to, you mean at the high schools?
At the high schools.
Right. There are no plans to close the campuses at the high school. And again, the Citizens Advisory Council, year before last, I think, that was a topic, the closed campus policy. It surfaces as an issue almost annually because there are always those in the community, concerned parents usually, who believe that a closed campus is a safer environment for students. And so it was a topic that our Board of Education asked the citizens to study. And they spent a year looking at all of the pros and cons of the cost factors that would be involved in doing that, at student interest, at student maturity levels, and they determined that we were better served to have open campus at lunch. And it has not come up this year as an issue, and there are no plans. Now, you need to understand, again, that that could be a policy issue that could come before the Board of Education, and that could surface it really at any time. But right now, if nothing changes between now and the time we open the schools, there will be open lunches at Norman High School and at Norman High School North.
Does the issue of the two high schools impact you at the ages you are, or is this something only seniors worry about, or is this something, or this year's juniors, or is this something that everybody's got high on their minds?
Well, we've been discussing what high schools we're going to be going to, but we haven't really been worrying about it. It's not a really big deal.
Well, I've thought about it a lot, because when we start looking at most of my friends, there'll be a bunch of us that'll be going to North, and then there'll be maybe one or two of us that'll be going to Norman High, which really separates us, and those two kids feel more left out than the other ones do. Just the fact that they're leaving the group when most of the group's going somewhere else. So most of the kids my age, I think a lot about it.
Mm-hmm. Are you confident that both schools will be good places to be?
Well,
is there a sense that one will be less good than the other?
in some aspects, I think some people think that, but I'm not really worried about it. I think it'll be pretty much equal.
I think it'll be equal in many ways. Most kids, they think that just because North will be new, it won't be as good as Norman High because it's not as experienced or something like that. When I don't see that coming. I think they'll be both equally
good places to be.
Equal good places to live.
Okay.
Or to go to school.
Well,
Yes.
you can live there. That's kids pretty much do.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that the sense of equality comes from having, I know at Central we spend a lot of time with the kids figuring out who's going to be with them where, and that seemed to relieve a lot of tension when they suddenly realized that a lot of their friends were going to be with them. Do you think that has helped to give that sense of equality?
Yeah, that's definitely made people feel less, singled out or like they're the only person in the entire school going to Norman North or Norman High.
I think it helped a little to realize that, yes, some kids would be going, you'd still have friends with you, but I think it also made a lot of people realize and wake up real quick and realize that they're losing it. They're not necessarily losing a lot of their friends, but they'll have friends that won't be going to school with them anymore. Well, a lot of them don't realize that there's kids from West that are the friends that they'll also be going to school with now, which is what I think about because I have a lot of friends at West that will be joining me at North.
Okay, did you find that to be true when you started looking at how it would break down?
Yeah, I left a lot of my friends from Longfellow behind at West, so I'm going to be seeing them again at Norman North.
Okay. What got you interested in politics?
Stacy, I've always been interested in politics looking back. My father was the chaplain at North Carolina State University as I grew up, and that is Jesse Helms territory. If you know that name, he's the U.S. Senator from North Carolina. And they were about 180 degrees apart from each other in their philosophy, and so there was a lot of talk around our table. My mother is still a secretary in the North Carolina legislature, and I was a page as a kid growing up. I never thought of it as a career. In fact, I can remember working with Carolyn Thompson on some issues, promising myself I would never do this after I saw the hard work that she had to put in and all the variables. I had an opportunity when Carolyn left to seek this job, which I did, and I'm delighted to be here and very glad to eat those words and say I didn't want to do this. But I think looking back, while I had not directed my life toward politics, it is very much in my family, the participation in the kinds of events that go on in the world and in society that we have some responsibility for.
How long do you plan to pursue your political career, and how far do you want to take it?
Well, that certainly depends on the voters about how long I pursue it. I definitely want to stay in the House of Representatives another term or two. to do some of the work that we have started right now. And I think in politics you also find that so much of it is the timing in the moment of opportunity. You have to be prepared, you have to be competent to do the job, and yet a lot of it is timing. There are only so many positions that one might be elected to. So there is no crystal ball to tell where I will go, what I will do. I do think that I have an ability to do public service. I have the fortitude to do public service and have enjoyed it. I would like to find some place to continue to contribute back to society, whether it be through elected position or something else.
What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of working at a station like OTA as opposed to a commercial station?
I think probably the big advantage that we have is that we don't have commercials. And that sounds maybe kind of trite, but we don't have to look at the ratings book to determine what kinds of stories we want to cover. And I think that's an advantage that we have. Also, we don't have the breaks, so people sit down with our newscast at 6:30 in the evening, Monday through Friday, and they know, for better or for worse, that they're going to see news for pretty much 30 minutes straight without breaks. The commercial stations, because of the constraints that they have to sell the commercial time to stay on the air, will only present about 11 or 12 minutes of news in a 30-minute newscast. We can present over 20, and I think that's a good thing.
How does OETA decide what political shows to cover, and are you part of that decision at all?
I'm really not a part of that decision. As far as the programming, we have people who've been involved in the programming business for a long time who make the decisions about which shows we want to air when we're talking about programs that appear on a nightly or weekly or annual basis. So I'm really not involved in that decision too much. I think the people who do make the decisions try to look at what's available for the cost and what our viewers, people in the state of Oklahoma, all over the state of Oklahoma, might be most interested in seeing. I think diversity is a good idea. I sometimes would like to see a little more diversity because we are PBS, because we don't have to sell commercials, and we might be able to put on a program that a commercial station wouldn't, because they find they can't find anybody that wants to buy commercials in it. On the other hand, we also have a responsibility to the people of Oklahoma who fund us in part through legislative appropriation and also through donations to put programs on that we think they want to see. So those decisions are made with that kind of thinking, but I really don't have that much input into that.
If someone wanted to volunteer or join, how would they do that?
The best way to get involved with CRASH is through the national office, and you can do that by calling 1-800-CRASH, C-R-S-C-H, 12. And if you call that number, they will send information to you, an information packet, and keep you updated on their lobbying efforts.
How much response have you got from the government?
I have written letters to our local representatives, federal representatives, and also to Secretary Pena of the Department of Transportation, and I've gotten favorable response on those letters. Everyone recognizes this as an issue that is important, and they offer to give it their strongest consideration from the aspect of safety when issues come to a vote. Now, how that turns out when they actually vote, we don't know, but Secretary Pena has met with members of our organization who are victims and survivors of truck crash accidents, and he's been very sympathetic with our interests, and he's instructed his negotiating staff to keep safety as their #1 priority in these NAFTA negotiations. So we've been effective from that standpoint.
But there's been no actual vote yet in the House or Senate that would reflect?
There will be legislation that comes before Congress next year, and the Intermodal Transportation Act Part 2, I believe, comes before Congress in the 97 session. And there will be significant issues brought forth and important votes that occur then.
I'd like to ask, what is the most common characteristic of violent relationships?
Okay, the most common characteristic of violent relationships is usually the male, usually is the badder or the more violent person, and the most common characteristic is the male that actually is leading the female around, is answering questions for her, is making all the decisions, is profoundly jealous of her, but you can see the power difference in the two, that there's not an equal relationship, and it's real obvious to other people.
No controlling.
No, right, real controlling.
Okay. Do you think that if children are abused more during their early childhood, do they later show a tendency to end up in abusive relationships?
Okay, what we know about children and abuse and all of that a child raised in a violent home is 1,500 times more likely to be abused than a child raised in a home in which there's not violence. A child raised in a violent home is 700 times more likely to be abusive than a child raised in a nonviolent home. So yeah, there is that tendency because it's modeled to them. We learn about relationships from watching people in our lives have relationships, and if they're taught that you resolve conflict with violence, then they're more likely to learn that. Doesn't mean that all kids raised in violent homes become violent. It sure does not mean that, but there is a lot more likelihood of it.
Okay. On House Bill 1017, do you think it helped or it hurt the systems? And was there anything that you'd like to change on it?
It very clearly helped the system, Stacy. It solidified for the citizens of Oklahoma an opportunity to say to the legislature, not just once, but every year, we believe that we have a right to high-quality education, and we believe that education is the future for our children. So it was extremely important, and what it did do in terms of diminishing class size, that's one of the themes that we have held on to. Some changes, but we've held on to that. There are pieces of 1017 that we have modified. We've had to modify them for monetary reasons. I wish we hadn't. This year we were slated for class sizes for grades 6, 7, and 8 to have to be 120, I think it was. And we went ahead and said, no, we'll let you stay at 140 per teacher. I wish we could have kept that, but we did keep the smaller caps in the elementary grades, and hopefully we'll be able to stay with some of the original intent of 1017. One of the programs we've never funded was the Healthy Living course that was to deal in a very positive way and in a voluntary way with issues of contagious diseases, starting with kindergarten, be sure you wash your hands before lunch, be sure you wash your hands after you sneeze. Things that I think families would be very supportive of. So 1017 was a major effort, it was a good effort. We have modified some of the errors that in implementation were not possible. No bill is perfect, but I think that really set the course for Oklahoma.
Great. Since 1964, Oklahoma has voted Republican in the presidential election. Do you think this year will be any different?
I think that it will not be different in the sense that as a state we will vote Republican. I think that the spread between the votes for Dole and the votes for Clinton will be much smaller than we have seen. I suspect it will still go Republican at the national level, would be my guess.
Do you see then the congressional representation staying heavily Republican?
I think we'll see some changes in the congressional seats. I think Glenn Johnson is running a very, very good race in the 2nd District. I think we have a very challenging race here in the 4th District between Congressman Watts and Ed Crocker. And I think we will see yet to develop an exciting race in the 3rd District as well with Wes Watkins and I hope Darrell Roberts. So I believe there will be changes in the congressional seats.
What about the Senate?
The Senate seat, I think, is more for grabs than we realize. We're talking about an incumbent who is entrenched with financial resources and a challenger who has very few resources but is very bright, is very energetic, and carries a message that I think better represents all Oklahomans, Democrats and Republicans, than the incumbent does. So it really will be, I think, a contest between the message and the money.
The governor says that the economic prosperity in Oklahoma is really a false prosperity. How do you feel about this perception?
I think the reason he says that is that he was in Washington during the 80s working for the Bush and Reagan administration when we really had extraordinary economic crisis in Oklahoma. Sandy and I at least remember when unemployment was double-digit in Oklahoma, where people were leaving the state. We had a net decrease in population after the oil bust of the early 80s. Now, the governor was in Washington, and I don't think that's a real world up there. If they run out of money, if things get tight, they print it. We can't do that in Oklahoma. It's called taxes and balancing a budget. So the bottom line is the governor came back in 92 or 93, run for governor. He's our governor. I want to support him where I can. But when he's critical of the economic efforts in this state, as he is almost every day, that flies in the face of the creation of 43,000 new jobs over the last 2 years because of the Quality Jobs Act. And a law passed and signed by a man that we never say anything nice about, a guy named David Walters, who used to be governor. So I think, and I'll close with this, I wish the governor would occasionally look for the good things going on in Oklahoma. He would be a better salesman for our state if he would do that.
Great. How do you define the prison problem, and how would you go about solving it?